Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of Genesis. And today we'll actually be wrapping up Genesis as we look at chapters 48 through 50. And what we're going to see today is the end of the lives of both Jacob and Joseph there in the end of this book. So we begin with Joseph and his son. So what we see in chapter 48, it begins with Jacob blessing Joseph's son. So Manasseh and Ephraim, they're now going to enjoy the same status as Jacob's other 12 sons, which is a little bit unusual, but remember that Joseph was the favorite child, and so Jacob is kind of elevating his children because they're Joseph's children. And Joseph actually objected to this, but Jacob went ahead and anointed them and ignored Joseph's objections anyway. And he goes on to bestow the greater blessing on Ephraim, the youngest son, instead of on Manasseh, the firstborn, which is interesting because if we remember, Jacob himself was a firstborn, was not a firstborn. His brother Esau was the firstborn, and Jacob stole his birthright, and Joseph was not a firstborn, but because he was Jacob's favorite, he was the favorite child, even though he was not the first child. But so it's just interesting to see how that has played out and continued. And so in that chapter, Israel, or Jacob, or his name had been changed to Israel, said to Joseph, "I had not thought to see your face, but in fact, God has shown me also your offspring," which is, God often blesses us in ways that are far beyond anything we can imagine. We hope for one thing, so like maybe we hope for A, and then God gives us the whole alphabet. Like, God's dreams or God's plans for us are so much bigger than what we can imagine. So I think that's why sometimes it's really important that we don't limit ourselves to our goals or our dreams or where we see ourselves, where we see our futures going. And it is important that we make sure that we focus on what God wants us to do, and we focus on where God wants to take us, because he can take us further than we would ever dream that we could be. And so he then goes ahead and he blesses Joseph and said, "God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life to this day." So when Israel called God the God who has fed me all my life to this day, he proclaimed that every good thing we have comes from the hand and the grace of God. And we know that was true for Jacob. He was acknowledging it. And of course, it's also true for us. So then in chapter 49, we look at Jacob blessing his sons. And we're going to go through this, and we're going to see each son is blessed. And it's going to kind of describe them and talk about kind of some of the ways that they're being blessed by their father. So we see the blessing of Jacob on his sons right here. And the first one is Reuben in verses 3-4. He's unruly as the stormy sea, and he's demoted because of his immorality. The next sons are Simon and Levi. They're violent men given to anger and cruelty, so their descendants will be scattered throughout Israel. Judah, he will be praised by the brothers and will defeat his enemies. Praised by his brothers and will defeat his enemies. The scepter, or the royal line, will not depart from him until the coming of the one to whom it belongs. And in case you don't know who that's talking about, what it says in verse 10, chapter 49, verse 10, in exact words, it says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be." So Israel, he foresaw that the Messiah, Jesus, would come through the line of Judah, and that he would be both the king and the judge of the whole earth. So when he's blessing them, when he says Judah, the scepter will not depart from you, he's saying that the Son of God, Jesus, the Messiah, will come from the line of Judah. And we know that's going to happen. But the next son is Zebulun. He will live by the seashore and become a harbor for ships. Then Issachar, he will work with animals and till the land. Dan, he will be like a snake beside the road. That doesn't sound like a compliment to me. Gad, he will defend himself against all enemies. Asher, he will produce rich food fit for kings. Naphtali, he will be as free as a deer. And then Joseph, he will be like a fruitful tree beside a fountain, blessing others. He's been persecuted, but he has been strengthened by God. He will be blessed by God, and he will be a prince among his brothers. And the last blessing was for Benjamin. And he says that he will devour his enemies like a hungry wolf. So after he's done blessing his sons, Jacob again requests to be buried with his ancestors in the cave of Machpelah at Hebron, and then he dies. So after that, and this is what happens at the beginning of chapter 50, after a 70-day period of mourning, the 12 brothers carry their father's embalmed body to Hebron. So the people of Egypt, they were famous for their embalming practices. We know that. And they took care of his body, and then after the 70-day mourning period, the brothers took him and buried him amongst his ancestors, which was very important. Now, after that, the brothers were a little bit nervous because, remember, they had sold Joseph into slavery, and now Joseph is kind of a big deal in the land of Egypt. So after they returned from Egypt, after burying their father, they're worried about what Joseph is going to do. So Joseph tries to calm their fears that he will seek revenge, and he tells them that God turned into good what you meant for evil. And this is one of my favorite passages in this account of Joseph, because it really shows who Joseph was, and it showed how he matured over the process of this story, because it says, "But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save many people alive." So Joseph, he knew, no, he didn't want to be sold into slavery. No, that was not a good time for him. But what else it was is he was able to see that God used that opportunity to save so many lives. And I wouldn't say that he was thankful to be sold into slavery because, okay, he was sold into slavery, but I think he is thankful for how his life has turned out. And so Joseph is telling his brothers, don't worry, because you might have meant this originally for evil, but God had a plan and God used it. So sometimes God will allow us to go through difficult times, even as a result of the wicked actions of others. But whatever we have to endure, no matter how unfair or unjust, we can be sure that God will use it for good. God's ways are not our ways, and his plans are not our plans. Sometimes God can be working and doing something beautiful in the midst of some of the most trying and difficult times of our lives. And that can be hard to accept. That can be hard to understand. But it is a hope that we can cling to, that we know that God, as it says in Romans, is working together for the good of those who love him. And so if we are God's people, if we do love him, and if we do look to serve him, even in the midst of difficult times, we can trust that God is with us and God has a plan, and we have that blessed hope of the future that God has for us. And so then this book wraps up with the death of Joseph in the last few verses there, starting at verse 22. So Joseph lives to see the third generation of Ephraim's children, and then he dies at the age of 110, and that is going to be the end of the book of Genesis. So we've seen a lot here in the book of Genesis. We've seen a lot of really important people. We've seen a lot of the Old Testament heroes of the faith with Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Isaac. And here we are. They are now, God's people are now in the land of Egypt. And if you're familiar with the book of Exodus, we know that the next few 100 years are not going to be especially pleasant for his people. But we will pick that up next week when we start the book of Exodus. So until then, I will see you tomorrow back in 1 Samuel.